Sometimes you get dealt a good hand. We had booked Jonathan Wilson to talk about Pep Guardiola, and then overnight, Unai Emery becomes the Aston Villa boss. So I get to ask you about that as well, Jonathan. Good morning to you. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
I'm a Villa fan, so I'm pretty happy, actually. I think. Should I be happy?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think Emery is a very, very good coach. I think what we saw of him at Arsenal, I think wasn't probably as bad as it was made out to be. I think there was sort of a lot of mockery of him for his English, which is a ludicrous thing to complain about. I think perhaps people hadn't quite appreciated how difficult it was to replace Wenger. But you look at his record at Sevilla, at Villarreal. He is a very, very good coach. I have two slight notes of caution. The first is to do with him, which is that all his success has come in Spain. That whenever he's left Spain, it hasn't really worked out for him. So PSG, I mean, yes, he won the league there, but I think he found that very, very difficult. Yeah, PSG is an extremely difficult club to manage. Arsenal, I guess you put in the same bracket, a difficult club to manage for different reasons. When he went to Spartak Moscow, it didn't really work out for him there. Again, I think there are mitigating circumstances, but the three attempts he's had outside of Spain haven't been great. So that's one note of caution. And the second is to do with the club, which is if they approached, as we're led to believe, Pochettino and Thomas Tuchel and possibly also Brendan Rodgers, I'm not seeing any sort of consistency, anything that links those four coaches. That feels like they're just going for famous people. Three of whom happen to be former PSG managers. So I would worry that there's a sort of lack of a overarching plan behind the scenes. But yeah, maybe they feel that they're at a stage of a development where they need a coach to lead that development after what I think was a pretty dismal failure of the Steven Gerrard year.
Yeah, it's funny you bring up the celebrity of that list, and I was actually thinking that this is kind of a reaction to the Gerrard failure. It's like somebody with vast experience versus somebody who was really at the start of their, apart from the 3.5 years or 2.5 years at Rangers, like a very inexperienced coach who is very famous as a player. Here is somebody who is very experienced comparatively, who doesn't have a stellar playing career behind him, and very often clubs and international federations who don't really know what they're doing, they go one way and then that didn't work, so let's go the complete diametrically opposite, which would suggest that it's not particularly visionary or it's not part of an overarching plan.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I think what Gerrard plus the those four names we just listed have in common is they are really well known. So what I'd like my club sporting director to be doing is saying, right, this is the sort of football we want to play. Here's my list of half a dozen players for every position who we might be targeting. We're monitoring them, looking at their progress, looking at where their contract situation is, and also have a short list of maybe half a dozen coaches who you can turn to if things go wrong. And those coaches, I guess, ideally, would not necessarily be household names. They'd be, there's this guy who's doing brilliant stuff at Paderborn, or doing great stuff in the Greek league or whatever. And your expertise has allowed you to identify a sort of cheap prospect, a cheap target. But clearly there is a massive risk with that sort of figure. Emery, I think, is somebody worth having a punt on, because, as I say, I think he's probably better than Villarreal. I think he's probably undervalued in this country, certainly. And in terms of having success with a club who's just outside the elite. So, success in Spain wasn't with Real Madrid or Barcelona. It was with Sevilla and Villarreal. If you want somebody to take you into the Europa League, and his record in the Europa League is phenomenal. I mean, 4 wins plus another final. So I think there's a logic from that point of view. But yeah, that concern of what is the long-term vision. And I think you've seen that with the signings. I mean, if you've signed Emi Buendia for what I think was a club record fee, and then almost immediately you're signing Felipe Coutinho, and can you play the two together? did you just get Coutinho because he was famous and because he was available?
Yes.
I think that has sort of dogged their decision making over the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, there's a lot of those players at the club who are kind of, we've got two players in the same position who are equally not effective at the moment. What style of football does Emery play? Is he more flexible? Does he have a particular style that he always uses everywhere?
Well, I think what he's very, very good at doing is setting up his team to frustrate better teams. I think that's why his success has really come in those two-legged European competitions. I think he's exceptional at that. He's never really put together a phenomenally consistent run over a league season. So I think it is pretty, they're not going to be massively on the front foot. They're not going to be massively attacking. I think his strength is in creating a team that's going to be solid and going to attack well on the break. Whether the squad is ideally suited for that, I'm not convinced. I think the issues at the centre of defence, I think, would test any coach. He obviously has worked with Carlos before, as and when he returns to fitness. So yeah, he's from the slightly more controlled side of Spanish football rather than the sort of free flowing uber possession style.
So don't expect blood and thunder and lots of excitement in my football watching future.
Well, no, but I think it will be a lot more fun than Gerrard. So,
okay. Well, that wouldn't be hard.
Relative terms, yeah.
We were due to talk last week, but the Gremlins were in the system about Pep Guardiola and this body of evidence that's growing about... well, I don't know how to phrase this without kind of making it too black and white, but it does certainly seem as if sometimes, instead of picking his best players in his best positions, he decides to respond to what he expects the opposition to do, and then therefore hands the opposition an opportunity to get into games where you sometimes feel like if he just plays his best players, it could be 2-0 at half time and the game would largely be over. You've done loads of work, you've written about this extensively. A week on, and now knowing everything we know about this Liverpool team, what was in Pep's head in the build-up to the Liverpool game?
I think in many ways it's sort of the greatest narrative, certainly on the pitch, of football over the last sort of 10 years or so, that you have this brilliant coach who is habitually in charge of brilliant teams with brilliant players, and you just sort of think, well, just go out and do it. And they would win more often than not. And yet again and again and again, in the biggest games, particularly in Europe, he fails. And his record in Europe, given how successful he's been domestically, given the stature of club he's been in charge of, to only have won the Champions League twice, remarkable achievement as that is, it feels like he's falling short. And I think the fact that he had the success early, wins it in 2009, wins it in 2011, and you look at the way that Barcelona team, which I think is probably the greatest team of my lifetime, the way they went out the Champions League in both 2010 and 2012. So 2010, the game against Mourinho's Inter, where they were 3-1 down from the first leg, and they win 1-0, but that's not enough. And they have 81% of the ball and all the shots in the world, and they can't score. Then almost even more freakish, the defeat to Chelsea in the semi-final in 2012. And it's like those two defeats, which you should be able to write off as freaks, but it's like they've sort of got in his head. And he's sort of thinking, well, what caused them? Oh, it was because we got done on the break. So what we've got to do is we've got to stop ourselves getting done on the break. And then everything he does to prevent getting caught on the break somehow seems to make his team even more vulnerable, while also diminishing the attacking qualities they have. So you saw that when Bayern lost to Atletico, which was that also semi-final in 2016. Yes, they were by far the better team, but somehow luck went against them. And the more that luck's gone against him, the unluckier he seems to get, and the more he seems to make these tweaks and these changes. I think the Lyon game is the one that you sort of think, yeah, it's Lyon. They're a mid-table side in France. Just go out and batter them in the same way you'd batter, Villa or Brighton or whoever. But switched to a back three, and they got done by Maxwell Cornet. And then even Liverpool last week, I mean, Klopp has a better record than any other coach against Guardiola. Certainly of any coach who's played more than sort of 4 or 5 games against him. I think he's the only coach who's got a better than 50% record. And there's something in Klopp's football which clearly Guardiola teams find hard to play against. But Liverpool this season have not been good. You sort of think it's an opportunity for City just to go out, just to play, and they almost certainly will overwhelm them in the way that Fulham on the opening day of the season, although it was only a 2-2 draw, Fulham had by far the better of that game. You think, well, if you have that plus you have Haaland, you will win, and yet he goes to that sort of hybrid formation, that sort of semi back three. He's got Cancelo playing as a right wing back rather than on the left, where he was far less effective. We'd seen the previous season that Foden against James Milner. I mean, Milner should have been sent off last season. Foden absolutely destroyed him in that game. But rather than just letting Foden run at him, he plays him slightly deeper in a sort of semi-left wing-back role. And I think it's, even if you can make a rational case for each of those tactical switches, I think the cumulative effect is twofold. So one is, it's just not the shape City are used to. And I accept that he makes tweaks all the time that we perhaps don't acknowledge. But that was a radical shift from that basic 4-3-3 template. So some of that familiarity, some of that naturalness, some of that cohesion has gone. But also, I think players have begun now to sort of think, oh, God, what's he done? He's done it again. And so I certainly heard players talking about that in the aftermath of the Champions League final against Chelsea. And I heard Chelsea players saying the opposite. They looked at the City team sheet and thought, he's done it again. So overthinking maybe is a sort of an oversimplistic way of putting it. But there is this tendency to make changes that are probably needless in the biggest games. And I find it fascinating that he is like this Greek tragic hero, that he has this fatal flaw that undermines him over and over again. No. And the great thing is, where City could just be this sort of steamroller, charging through everything, winning everything all the time, the humanness, that human frailty, that doubt, means that they don't. And that, I think, is from a narrative point of view, is fascinating.
I think that Foden example you bring up, Jonathan, is a perfect one. Like, if you're a City fan, you're watching that game going, Jesus, just let the man get forward. I mean, as you said, he's tormented Milner in the past, so not encouraging him to do the same seemed a very strange one. And look, this back three, or de facto back three, as you say, like, if it's set up to stop City being so vulnerable in the counter attack, the reality is it just didn't work. So do you think going forward Pep is going to continue with it? Is he dogged and arrogant like that he's going to say no, next time we're going to try it again? Or do you think he'll learn from his mistake?
I don't think it's an arrogance. I think, if anything, it's the opposite. I think it's an insecurity that he knows that's, there's this brilliant, no team is perfect. The blanket is never quite big enough. There's always a slight gap. And in Guardiola teams, it is that because they play the high line, because they hold possession so well, that a direct ball, a quick ball over the top can undo them. Now Guardiola previously has tried to counter that, that line he came out with, which, to be honest, it took me a long time to really sort of work out what he meant. And I think it's only really this season that I think I fully understood what he meant, because we're now seeing the opposite. And that line is that when City win the ball, unless there's a really obvious chance of an immediate counter-attack, he doesn't want his team to do what a Klopp team would do, which is just to surge forward and try and hit the opposition when they're not quite set. He wants his team to control possession, control the ball. He says have 15 passes to get set, because if you attack before that, you're not ready for the opposition to counter against you. And that I think is one of the reasons why, at its worst, Guardiola football can be a little bit sterile, a little bit tepid, because you don't have that sort of end-to-end nature you get with a Klopp team, for instance. That it is very much about control. But when you have Erling Haaland there, you can't play like that, because if you look at the Community Shield, when Haaland was widely criticised, where I think he had 16 touches he had or something, but then you watch it back and you look at how many runs he made where the ball wasn't being played quickly enough, and if the ball had just been knocked into space, an easy pass for anybody, never mind Kevin De Bruyne or Bernardo Silva, and the pass just wasn't played because they were getting set, ready to prepare the structure in case they lost the ball and they were counted against. But Haaland needs the ball quickly. That's one of his great strengths. And not to play to that would make no sense. So they are going a bit more direct. But I think what that does is it exacerbates that vulnerability that's already there. And you saw that the game against Newcastle when they were 3-1 down. You saw it against Palace when they were 2-0 down and should have been 3-0 down. That flaw that's always been there is there but magnified. Now, whether the extra goal threat of Haaland is worth that, I think we'll only see in the last stages of Europe. City scoring lots of goals is almost irrelevant. They've been the top scorer in the Premier League for the last 5 seasons. If Haaland means they score 10%, 20% more goals, well, sort of so what? What's important is in the Champions League quarterfinal, semi-final, final, does that increased vulnerability to a thing that they're already worried about, is that counteracted by the fact they can also now score goals when not in control, when not necessarily playing particularly well?
He gave a relatively interesting interview to Jan-Åge Fjørtoft. There's 10 minutes of it on Fjørtoft's Twitter, if anybody wants to watch it, where he didn't have the usual kind of slightly patronising attitude towards the questions. He was interested and engaged in them. And I don't know if I believe him or not, but he says that the first thing he does is he looks at his players and then he adapts the style of play to the players that he has available to him. Now, maybe on a week-to-week basis, or when he arrived at Bayern Munich, that might have been something he did. And clearly at Man City, he's been there long enough they're all his players, really. But the arrival of Haaland and injecting him into the team, the way you're speaking about it, kind of forces a bit of a rethink there. And maybe it's true. Maybe having Erling Haaland means he is going to ask his players not to have the 15 passes before they ping one long. Just to ping a few long and let's see what happens. Is this where the evolution comes, and maybe he himself becomes more automatic in his thinking as opposed to in himself so much?
I don't think it's automatic. I think he will look at Haaland and he'll say, right, we've got this extraordinary asset. How do we use him best? And we've seen, I think, an evolution. I mean, that goal, was it the first goal against Brighton on Saturday? Was just Ederson smacked it long? Like, you wouldn't have seen... I mean, it's an absurd thing to say you wouldn't have seen him doing that to Sergio Aguero, because Aguero wouldn't have relished that type of pass. He certainly wouldn't have done it last season when they didn't really have a forward and he'd been pinging it at Foden playing as a false 9 or something. So I think we are seeing them play more direct. The game against West Ham, you saw how much more direct they were. I think City, certainly in the Premier League or the early stages of the Champions League, they're never going to be that direct because teams very rarely come out against them, so there's no space to hit with direct passing. You've sort of got to manipulate the space a bit to create that space. So Guardiola, I think he has evolved. I think he's evolved a lot since 2008. I think that's been one of the fascinations is what the last sort of decade or so is watching how he and Klopp have both evolved. They've challenged each other and they've both learned from that. So, yeah, you evolve from changes in football. You evolve from the players you have available, and you evolve from what the opposition is doing against you. I don't think there's ever been any doubt that Guardiola is. It's not that he has his one true method and applies that in all circumstances. Yeah, he's always tweaked it and changed it. The danger is of the thing that's undone him, I think, in certain Champions League games is that he's done that too much. He almost hasn't trusted himself, hasn't trusted his process enough. Whereas maybe a more relaxed coach would just sort of say, we're the best team in Europe, go out and win it.
I'd love to see what would happen if he did that. Just like how those players would respond. It'd be. Look, maybe he gets done on a counter attack in that game, and we're all like, oh, that's you are cursed.
The time he sort of did that was when Bayern went to Barcelona in 2015, and he sort of, it was almost like the logic was nothing we can do will stop Lionel Messi, so let's just go for it. Let's press really hard. Let's press really high. I don't know if you remember that game, but. It was. I think it was still 0-0 after about 75 minutes, and Barca went on to win 3-0 because Bayern were absolutely shattered. But that first 20 minutes, half an hour, Barcelona could have been 4 or 5-0 up. And I think he's also got that warning in his mind that if we are too loose, that's what can happen. And I also just think the person he is, if he, all the success he's had, everything, even as a player, has been through analysis. It's been thinking. As a player, he wasn't naturally a great player. He was a great mental player. He tactically, he was a great player. Technically, he was a very good player, but it was tactically, he was a great player. And if he didn't do the research, if he didn't make those little tweaks and make those little changes, and then it failed, I think that he would really feel like he'd let himself down. I mean, the thing that I'm always conscious of with this is, do you remember after the Bielsa and the Spygate furore, when Bielsa gave that 2-hour press conference, and somebody, I think, asked the question, why do you need to do all this research into the opposition when you have bundles of data and bundles of research that you can just you subscribe to some service and you just download it? And Bielsa said something like, I have to look under every rock, even though I know it is useless, because if I didn't, I wouldn't be true to myself and I would never forgive myself. And I wonder if there's something in similarly neurotic about Guardiola, that he feels that his job is to investigate every permutation, to investigate every combination, to analyze everything. And if he doesn't do that, if he did just sort of say, go out and play, that he would be letting down the club, letting himself down professionally.
Jonathan, I know you wrote a match report on the Chelsea United game at the weekend, and which probably leads me to believe you were in the press box there with a close vantage point in Stamford Bridge to the two managers. What were your main takeaways from that game? And I guess seeing Erik ten Hag up close, he's reportedly sitting down with his number 7 Cristiano Ronaldo today for peace talks, but he certainly wasn't holding back with those celebrations late in the game with Casemiro's goal. But a fascinating game to be at, I'd imagine.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I'm very glad I was doing the follow-up, not the runner, because I think that would have been an incredibly difficult game to write on live, because it was one of those matches where you couldn't sort of say, oh, this is just rubbish, and sort of slag the game off and say, this is really boring, nothing's happened. It was constantly intriguing, but it was very difficult to know which way it was going to go. So one of the great things with where the press box is at Stamford Bridge, you're right behind the away dugout. So when Fred came on, what was that, 51 minutes, something like that? What was fascinating was just how much information he was given before he came on. Ten Hag had this magnetic tactics board, and was clearly, must have been a good sort of minute and a half of instructions. Then there was one of the younger backroom staff who had an iPad. I couldn't actually see what was on the iPad, so it was very difficult to know what he was being shown. But there must have been a good, I reckon, sort of 3 to 4 minutes of tactical instruction to Fred before he went on. And so the fact that you saw Chelsea change shape from a back three to that midfield diamond after, what was that, about 35 minutes, the Potter changed that. And you saw the pattern of a game change, that United's, having been pretty dominant, suddenly would force back 10 or 15 yards. And then, I guess, Ten Hag was just seeing how the beginning of the second half played out before he made the change, and they went to a diamond as well to match it up. So it was one of those games where you really saw coaches making tactical changes, and you saw the impact of that straight away. So I think Chelsea obviously will be frustrated to concede that late, but a draw was probably right. And I think you saw just how high a level both those coaches are working at. And the thing that's impressive with Ten Hag has been just how steely he's been. There was a moment in that Brentford game when they lost 4-0 when he looked a bit isolated and looked a bit lost on the touchline. And then the fact that the following day, even if it was only symbolic, having the players in doing that punitive 13k run because they ran 13k less than Brentford. And now you look at him in press conferences, and there is just that glint of something slightly dangerous and slightly unhinged in his eye. And I think you probably have to have that to face down Ronaldo, and he has done that, and he's got all the cards now. He's effectively won that battle.
It can't go any other way now. He's managed to take a situation where all of Ronaldo's fans in the media, and there's loads of them, who are week in, week out at the start of this, he needs to be in the team, what a great goal scorer, what a great presence around the place. Suddenly Ronaldo is diffident, obstreperous, egotistical, selfish, all these things that he was at the start, but now everybody is saying it. It's if you were to stand back, because I thought it was a ludicrous thing to say I couldn't put him on to humiliate him in the derby, but actually he was happy to put him on for 2 minutes at the end of the Spurs game. So he was playing a long game, and he seems to have won it very hands down.
Yeah, I mean, if he's been playing a game, it might just be that he did what he thought was right. You know, that he wanted Ronaldo on that last sort of 2 minutes plus injury time, just to hold the ball up, give him an outlet. But it's worked out very, very well for him. And I guess maybe if this was some sort of conscious plan, that was exactly the right time to do it after United's best performance in, I don't know, certainly well over a year. And I think that's the other thing. It's not just Ronaldo's behaviour; it's the fact that United now are actually playing good football again. That win against Spurs, they were incredibly impressive. The first half hour against Chelsea, they were well on top. A 1-1 draw at Stamford Bridge is a good result, and it was a high level of game. So I think the fact that there is obvious progress there, it's now's the time to. I mean, then the progress has come because Ronaldo's not on the team, and when he does play, as he did against Newcastle, as he has in a couple of Europa League games, they've looked pretty flat. They've lacked that fluency and mobility up front. So that even when Rashford is missing chances, his movement makes United function better. And I think that was always true, but I think it's become really obvious now.
Jonathan, great stuff. Thanks a million for joining us. That was great. Cheers.
Cheers, thank you.
Jonathan Wilson there. You can read his stuff in The Guardian and other places, of course, but loads of books out as well.